this very generous introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It is in some ways a difficult topic to talk about. I am a native of Ukraine, and most of my family still reside there. So this war is very difficult for me to process, also as a Ukrainian, not just a scholar. The past year has undoubtedly been one of the most dramatic and momentous in Ukraine's modern history. Russia's full-scale invasion has disrupted and transformed all aspects of life in Ukraine, setting into motion some tremendous changes, political, societal, cultural changes. Some Ukrainians, such as the sociologist Yevhen Holovacha, who is a very well-known sociologist in Ukraine, have called these changes tectonic. So I'm borrowing his term here because I do agree with him. And today I propose to look at some of these changes in an effort to understand more deeply the impact of Russia's war on Ukraine, and also to estimate how far-reaching these changes may be in the future. So some of these changes are obvious. We watch them on the news every day. Ukrainians have lost loved ones. They have witnessed massive destruction of life throughout the country. Many have lost homes, have seen their hometowns demolished, basically. There is a lot of displacement on an unprecedented scale that has happened, and I'll talk about that more later. Through this displacement, a lot of Ukrainian families have been separated and have had to communicate with their loved ones online. And because of the various Russian attacks on Ukrainian electric grid, some of this online communication is disrupted periodically. There is daily danger to life, and it's become a common part of daily life. A lot of Ukrainian life has moved into the bomb shelters. That includes educational life, cultural life, such as performances, and I'll talk about that later again. Volunteering has become a way of life for many Ukrainians as they try to contribute to the efforts to defend Ukraine from this invasion. And then drastic changes have happened in how Ukrainians now view Ukraine, its political institutes, themselves as Ukrainian citizens, and Russia as their neighbor. Finally, Ukrainian language and culture have become more of a way to fight back, to defend Ukraine. And they have really been deployed as a kind of defensive weapon in Ukraine's survival and fight for its existence. So, because I'm a literature scholar, a lot of the evidence and examples today will come not only from the media, social media including, or press interviews with various people, but also from literary works. And I want to mention two of them right from the start. The book on the left is an anthology of short texts by Ukrainian playwrights, and I have a paper copy here. It was just published in January of 2023 in English translation, and these are all short texts by 20 Ukrainian playwrights who were going to have a grand opening of their new theater in February of 2022 in Kyiv, and they called themselves the Theater of Playwrights. This was going to be an innovative theater dedicated to playwrights' vision for their texts and how they should be staged. They were planning a grand opening for early March, but because of the full-scale invasion, that never happened. However, they decided to keep working, and they have since produced a lot of wonderful testimonials. So these are texts that are true to life. They're about their own experiences of the war. And some of them are in the shape of dialogues, some are in monologues, some are very close to poetry. And all of them bear witness to these people's experiences of the war. And the anthology is called A Dictionary of Emotions in a Time of War. It was edited and put together by an American scholar and theater maker, John Friedman. It's available for sale online if you're interested. It's a wonderful look into what Ukrainians themselves say about their experiences of the war. The other resource is called A War Vocabulary. It was compiled by a Ukrainian poet and writer and literary scholar, Ostap Slavinsky. And this is an online project primarily, although I think a book publication will happen soon. It consists of fragments of stories about the war and Ukraine's resistance. And all of these stories are arranged alphabetically as these short definitions of the basic words, such as beauty, food, freedom. Slavinsky, as well as many other Ukrainians, have felt that now the war has changed life in Ukraine so dramatically that it's time to redefine our basic vocabulary. The words that we have used in their usual meanings so far are not sufficient to capture what is happening. And so I'll be drawing some examples today from this war vocabulary. One thing to note about both of these resources and the war vocabulary, some excerpts from it in English are available online too. So one thing to note is that even in their titles, right, we see this implication that it's time to redefine our language, that we need a new language, a new dictionary, a new vocabulary to discuss war in Ukraine. Because the experiences have been so difficult and so traumatic, and for the current generations of Ukrainians, really unparalleled, that most Ukrainians have not experienced anything of this kind in their lifetimes, except for the very, very elderly who have experienced World War II. So, to begin with, the main and most dramatic change is, of course, the killing of civilians and the masses of civilians that have suffered in Ukraine. It is very difficult to estimate how many civilians have been killed in Ukraine. The UN Human Rights Office has put out recently the number of 8,000 civilians. This is just the tip of the iceberg, as they themselves acknowledge. This is because these are only registered, recorded, and documented deaths. We do not know how many civilians have been killed in the territories that are still being occupied by Russia, and especially the city of Mariupol, which has suffered a lot during the 3-month-long bombardment by Russia and then during the occupation. Because Russians do not permit any international observers to enter Mariupol. We don't really know what is going on there, but drone footage has shown that there are new cemeteries appearing on the outskirts, new mass graves. And the image you see here is from a cemetery in Izum in the Kharkiv region. After the Ukrainian forces were able to liberate Kharkiv Oblast, they discovered these awful mass graves and where locals were burying those who were killed during the Russian occupation. So the trauma of witnessing such scenes of mass graves and devastation of civilian life is something that Ukrainian literature tries to bear testimony to. And this excerpt from a short poetic piece by Anastasia Kusudi, Ukrainian playwright, will illustrate how it tries to do that. The piece is called How to Talk to the Dead. Yesterday I saw 4 photos of Ukrainians who were killed by Russians. The first was a gray-haired man who was being lifted on a board from a mass grave. His pants were down to his calves. His chest was swollen. The second was a woman with long dark hair and a red jacket. Her arms were crossed on her chest. Lilies of the valley rose up to the right of the woman. To the left was earth plowed by explosions. At night, I lie down and recall doing an interview near Kyiv with an artist who is now exhuming bodies. At night, he said, I sometimes hear sounds. I don't fear them. They are dead. Let them come. They died so badly. I, at least, will talk to them. So this need to honor the innocent ones who died such senseless, violent deaths for no reason whatsoever is strongly felt in Ukrainian society. It is felt not just by writers, obviously, by ordinary Ukrainians as well, but most of them mourn in shock, in silence. Some express their outrage and are very vocal about it. But the writers are the ones who have taken on to themselves this very sad obligation to mourn them and make sure that we remember these victims. And so what I see happening in Ukrainian literature right now is an appearance of this whole subgenre of a literature of mourning and witness to these tragedies. Daily witnessing of death and a very real danger to one's own life, especially in the early days of the war, has also led to a real reassessment of values for many Ukrainians. And now life and their survival are really celebrated as an achievement of sorts and a great joy. So an excerpt from another piece by a Ukrainian playwright, a very famous playwright named Pavlo Arye, will illustrate this idea. Pavlo Arye lives in Kyiv, and in the very beginning of the war he decided to stay on, not to evacuate, and he decided to keep a diary to document his experiences, daily experiences of surviving. So this piece is called Diary of Survival of a Civilian Urbanite in Conditions of War. And it's a diary, so each day is mentioned. Day 2, 25th of February 2022. 7 a.m., a call from mother. Everyone is alive. Many messages and emails from friends from all corners of the world. I write a response on Facebook to everyone. I'm alive. Likewise, even communication itself between Ukrainian relatives and friends has been kind of boiled down, reduced to bare essentials, to the bare minimum. Gone are all the euphemisms that we usually resort to when talking about war and survival and death. The basic question is really captured well by this meme done by an artist from Kharkiv, and the meme says in Ukrainian, "Mom, are you alive?" And someone who has been calling my mom all through this war, almost daily, this has been the question that I've often wanted to ask her directly, in this very direct manner. I have tried not to do it. In fact, I've never asked her this directly. I just always say, "Mom, are you okay?" Every time there is a bombardment near Lviv or in Lviv, in the beginning of the war, Lviv has suffered some bombardments. I check on her and ask that question. But inevitably, she knows what I mean, and her response has always been, "I'm alive, don't worry, I'm okay." So this danger as an integral part of daily life is a constant theme in literature, in literary testimonies, as well as diaries and other types of eco-documents coming out from Ukraine right now. And it was especially prevalent in the early days of the war. Here is an excerpt from this anthology of war vocabulary compiled by Ostap Slavinsky, and this is by a woman from Vyzhhorod. Vyzhhorod is a small city to the north of Kyiv, when Kyiv was in danger of being run over by the Russians early on in the war. A lot of people were trying to evacuate from Vyzhhorod. So Katerina wrote this meditation on beauty, the meaning of the word beauty. I read a story about World War II not so long ago. There was this girl who wore her mom's worst clothes to pass by the Nazis unnoticed, to avoid being raped. I paused near my wardrobe. Is it time to wear the worst already? Or can I still make it? things change so quickly. The cabs are not coming. Either the line is busy or they refuse. I will just walk to Kyiv. In a time of war, beauty becomes dangerous. Beautiful things, people, relationships, nowadays they don't exist to inspire. They exist to be annihilated. Not for admiration and loving touches, but for pain. Now we know now from press coverage that a significant number of Ukrainian civilians have been subject to sexual violence by Russian soldiers, especially in the territories that were occupied for a while. Many of them are reluctant to come forward, but some have come forward and have been bravely testifying about their experiences. And just a few days ago, in early March, the First Lady of Ukraine, Oleksandra, spoke about this issue at a conference called United for Justice. And she stated that the number of victims among Ukrainian civilians who have suffered sexual violence show that this is a tactic consciously used by the Russian army against Ukrainian civilians as a physical and psychological weapon. Now, in addition to physical danger and violence and death, Ukrainian society has experienced tremendous displacement. According to the latest figures, over 8 million refugees from Ukraine have settled abroad. We have the numbers, unlike the numbers of civilians being killed, we do have better numbers for refugees because they register for temporary protection in European countries as well as in the United States and in Canada. This photo here shows a central train station in Warsaw in March of 2022 when Poland was flooded by Ukrainian refugees. And you see that there are beds set up right in the train station because there just weren't enough places to accommodate all of these people. Poland has welcomed 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees, the greatest number of all the countries, and Ukrainians are very grateful to our Polish neighbor for helping in such an awful time of need. In addition, more than 5 million people have been internally displaced in Ukraine from the regions that became war zones and occupied territories to western Ukraine. And these people too suffer the effects of displacement and longings of going back home. Now, it's interesting because scholars state that in most cases of war, 90% of refugees do not return home. Ukrainians have already proven this statistic wrong. They're actually coming back. At least the data that I have here for July 2022, more than 5.5 million internally displaced Ukrainians had returned to their homes. So the numbers in the beginning of the war of the internally displaced were much larger than the 5 million that we have now. And over 75% of Ukrainians displaced outside of Ukraine express their plans, talk about their plans to eventually return home. They say that the decision to return will ultimately depend on whether A, it would be safe to return with kids, and B, whether the displaced would actually have a home to return to. As we know, the destruction of residential buildings has been also quite considerable in Ukraine, so many people just don't have a place to return to. At the same time, a lot of these Ukrainian refugees long to come back, and some come back too early. So just recently, in the past week or so, I don't know if you have seen this on the news, but there was this very sad report of a family from the Zaporizhia region, from southern Ukraine, a young family, a couple, and they're 8 months old, who initially, in the beginning of the war, evacuated to western Ukraine, and then maybe 10 days ago or so, they decided to come back to Zaporizhia, the regional center of the oblast. And on March 2nd, there was a missile attack by Russia on Zaporizhia, and their building where they were staying crumbled, and the entire family is now gone. So they came back too early, but they wanted to come back. And so in trying to understand why people want to come back, I have looked at what writers say about this. So here's one point of view expressed by playwright Oleksandra in a play that she calls "I Want to Go Home." War is when you can't breathe out of hatred. War is when your body is convulsed with pain out of fear for your relatives. It is when you escape abroad with your child and spend all your time scrolling through the news. When you can't admire the sights of Europe's beautiful streets, your heart is at home. You cry, you can't cry. It was easier in Kyiv. It was easier on your own home ground. You're ashamed that you have left. And these feelings of shame and almost guilt for surviving are quite prevalent among Ukrainian refugees. They feel like they have abandoned their home and there are other compatriots who have stayed behind and are fighting. A lot of them long to come back. They want to reunite with their families, and a lot of them do come back, especially those who are displaced inside Ukraine. Now, for those who have stayed on, daily life looks drastically different. To give you just one example, education during war is quite a challenge. In early fall of 2022, when Ukrainian children were going back to school, a well-known Ukrainian journalist and TV host, Katerina Osacha, posted this on her social media. Just imagine for a second that you're packing your child's things for school, and instead of a sandwich for lunch, you pack food for 3 days. Because this is how long it might take to dig through the rubble to the bomb shelter where your child might be stuck. You also pack a flashlight, a change of clothes, a power bank, and notes with the parents' contact information everywhere. No, this is not a week-long trip to a summer camp. It's a regular day at an ordinary Ukrainian school in September of 2022. In some regions of Ukraine that are especially heavily hit, children actually study online. The pandemic has taught Ukrainians how to use Zoom as well, and so a lot of teachers opt for online lessons, and so do their students. This allows some of the refugees who are now abroad to actually maintain their children's education in Ukraine as well as abroad. And that's also quite a feat. They're trying to get your kid to do lessons in both countries at the same time. But some of them manage. So the bomb shelters have become places for some schooling, right? When there is an air raid siren, kids are supposed to go to the bomb shelter. But the arts and creative life has moved into the bomb shelters as well. Ukrainians have now, in this year, learned how to put their bomb shelters to very good use. And so I have a few images here to illustrate that. There are theater performances taking place in the bomb shelters. There are concerts taking place in the Kyiv subway station that became this one, the Kyiv subway system became this one giant bomb shelter for the residents of the capital. And there are even stand-up comedy shows being put on in bomb shelters. This one shows a show in Sumy. Sumy is a region of Ukraine that is experiencing a lot of artillery shelling because they're right very close to the border with Russia. And it's just plain dangerous to have any concerts in the normal buildings. So this daily ordeal of surviving in the times of war has brought about some crucial changes in Ukrainian society and in the perception, self-perception of Ukrainians. Ukrainian sociologists now note that regional differences in Ukraine are becoming significantly less pronounced. So before the war and the full-scale invasion, we did talk about a lot of regional differences in language and patriotism and such. These differences are rapidly disappearing, especially since February 24th. There is now greater unity among Ukrainians, and they're uniting around two things. One, against the common enemy, which is obvious. Two, around the common goal of victory in the war, which is also quite obvious. And unity is not something that comes easily to Ukrainians. In peacetime, there's a lot of debate and fighting. Families have had fallings out because they disagree about politics and such. But now, more than ever, Ukraine is united in these two goals. Changes happened in the quality of social connections and interactions in the society. So because there has been so much migration inside the country and so many strangers open their homes to refugees from other regions, there is higher trust now towards one's own compatriots, as well as to the authorities, so people in charge. This is especially true of local leaders, such as city mayors, who have shared the burden of war with their city residents from day one, and they have become kind of real celebrities for their city residents because they periodically appear on YouTube, they record videos with Essential Communications, where they explain how to resist and what to think and how to survive. So I have two images here. The top one is of the mayor of the city of Mykolaiv, Vitaly Kim. He has become somewhat of a hero in Ukraine in this past year for keeping his cool and not being fazed no matter what happens in the city. He records daily YouTube videos, at least he used to. I haven't checked in the past few months, but he used to record daily YouTube videos to encourage his residents to be strong, to keep their cool, to avoid, to hide in the bomb shelters when the air raid sirens sound. And this is a photo of him just, doing business as usual in his office during the full-scale invasion. The bottom image is of Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of the capital, the city of Kyiv. He's a former boxing champion and now a mayor who has had ups and downs. Before the full-scale invasion, there were a lot of critics of Vitaly Klitschko, but now during the full-scale invasion, his determination to defend the city, his effective communication to the residents of Kyiv about how that's going to happen, has really elicited a lot of trust from Ukrainians. So sociologists, such as the one I've mentioned already, Yevhen Holovacha, the director of the Institute of Sociology at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, are discussing a lot of these changes with surprise. They themselves were surprised how tremendous they were. Holovacha, for instance, in one of his recent interviews, mentions that before the war, many Ukrainians did not consider their society particularly united or resilient. The trust for the Institute of the President was very low. There were lots of critics of President Zelensky. In fact, during the most recent presidential election, there were literally fights in the country because many people wanted President Poroshenko to be re-elected, and Zelensky appeared to be someone who was not qualified for this office. But now, all of this has changed. Holovacha also mentions that in 2020, the majority of Ukrainians reported feeling disappointed about the Ukrainian state. But after the full-scale invasion, 90% of Ukrainians do not report the same feelings. He also says that in 2021, the primary emotion Ukrainians felt about the state of their country was sadness. And I'm not quite sure whether this has to do with the combination of the pandemic and kind of this feeling that an invasion is possibly coming. But nonetheless, that's the emotion that Ukrainians felt about the state of their country in 2021. However, after February 24th, the primary emotion is pride. And that's surprising too, considering the devastation, the loss of life, and all of these things we've already talked about. But I can testify that that is true. When I talk to my family members in the early days of the invasion, they too were shocked, but the next thing they would say is that they're proud to be Ukrainians. Holovacha also mentions that prior to the invasion, only 8 out of 10 people, residents of Ukraine, identify themselves as Ukrainians. After February 24th, 2022, this number is 10 out of 10. And so reflecting on why such a change is happening, Volovanka offered this opinion in the interview, and I think it's interesting, so I'll quote it. What we had was much better than what we thought. In comparison to those who came to us as occupiers, as aggressors, we have built a surprisingly normal and wonderful country. Well, it is clear that we only realize this in comparison to Russia. It is also clear that this does not save us from the problems that were and will be. However, we just realized that it would be a horror to lose what we had. So in an effort not to lose what we had, a lot of Ukrainians have engaged and continue to engage in various practices of resistance. Volunteering is probably the most visible and crucial of these practices, in addition to joining the armed forces of Ukraine, of course. And volunteering has reached a massive scale in Ukraine, and there are all kinds of types of volunteering, including some very creative ones. Of course, people donate, people organize fundraising efforts, people engage in evacuation of people and animals from occupied territories and the war zones. Ukrainians help the internally displaced, they run shelters, they open their own homes. They help the Ukrainian army with supplies. Some IT specialists joined cyber guerrilla army. So these are IT specialists who early on in the war would hack Russian governmental websites or Russian TV channels, state channels, in order to spread truthful information about Ukraine. And Russians were just outraged by some of these escapades. There are people who already work on rebuilding damaged houses and schools. There are volunteer psychologists who try to help Ukrainians cope with the stress of war. So in a nutshell, to be Ukrainian today almost means that you're involved in practices of resistance such as volunteering. And this meme illustrates this. So it says in Ukrainian, at the bottom, it says Ukrainians today, and it features a variety of people of various ages and genders doing what they can. The two women in the background are making camouflage nets. This is something that my mom has been doing from day one of the war, cutting up these strips of secondhand clothing and then taking them to a center where lots of Ukrainians are making these camouflage nets that are later used by Ukrainian armed forces to cover their military equipment, make it less visible to the enemy. The gentleman with the laptop on his lap says, "Okay, Google, how do I strike an enemy tank?" And the woman in the front says, and now, very quickly, I'll make 2,000 more Ukrainian vareniki for the boys, meaning in the army. So she's making them by hand. She's making Ukrainian pierogies, which are very labor intensive to make. So making 2,000 of them is quite impossible. And then the gentleman in the back says, "Oh, Musk," referring to Elon Musk, has sent a few more Starlinks, and so he's delivering them. So volunteering, one can say, has become almost a way of life for Ukrainians. There is this statistic that since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, only 15% of Ukrainians report not being involved in any type of volunteering. Everyone else is involved. And this continues. This is not a statistic just from the beginning of the war. Volunteering continues in Ukraine. Ukrainians demonstrate a very high level of self-organization. They lead and participate in a variety of initiatives. These are mostly grassroots initiatives, bottom-up initiatives. And they kind of envision that in the future this will continue with the rebuilding efforts. And to illustrate the extent of volunteering, I have this meme here of a very famous Ukrainian journalist, political activist, and volunteer, Serhiy Prytula, who has been famous for collecting a lot of funds very, very quickly to buy very expensive military equipment. So earlier in 2022, he managed to collect millions of dollars to purchase Bayraktars. These are unmanned combat aerial vehicles from Turkey that have proven to be very effective. And as soon as he appeared on social media with a call to donate money, Ukrainians heard the call and donated all the money that was necessary in like 2 days. So this meme says, and next week we're going to collect money for nuclear weapons. Another change that is especially interesting to me as someone who teaches Ukrainian is that many Ukrainians are switching from Russian to Ukrainian. They're either beginning to use much more Ukrainian in their daily life, and survey data from October 2022 gives us the figure of 42% of Ukrainians who have started using more Ukrainian in their daily life, and 14% of Ukrainians who have switched completely from Russian to Ukrainian. Now, this means both in professional life and daily life, in all spheres of communication, and this is quite hard, especially for someone who was entirely Russian-speaking up till that point. To illustrate how drastic this change has been for some people and how overnight, basically, I have a sentence here, I'll explain it to you. So this is a testimony, part of the testimony from Dmitro Kotov from Kramatorsk. Kramatorsk is in the Donetsk region, so right where a lot of the fighting is happening. And this is what he said. He said, "Легли мы спать 23 февраля." This is in Russian. We went to bed on February 23rd. А прокинулись 24 лютого. And this part is in Ukrainian. And we woke up on the 24th of February. So the only thing that changes here is the language, right? But it shows you the overnight change in the use of the language. Now, this effort to switch to Ukrainian has been made especially public by a lot of Ukrainian celebrities. I just have a few of them pictured here who have made this switch. And by the way, one of them switched back in 2014, and this is this gentleman in the upper right-hand corner, who is a poet, an eco-activist, and a volunteer soldier in the Ukrainian army. His name is Pavlova Shibaba. He is from eastern Ukraine. He made a conscious decision back in 2014 to switch from Russian to Ukrainian, and now he actively advocates for that decision on his social media, and a lot of people have listened. Other people on these slides are either bloggers, very famous YouTubers, or singers who have basically ditched all of their Russian language repertoire and have vowed from now on to only sing in Ukrainian. They also have decided not to collaborate any longer with any of their Russian colleagues. Now, why is such a change? Well, a lot of it comes from the fact that early on in the war, many Ukrainians, and many of them have relatives in Russia or friends in Russia, have used their social media platforms to appeal to these relatives and friends to do something, at least to recognize that a real war is happening. And they were so disappointed and felt so betrayed by the reaction. And these plays that I look at from this anthology, just about every second play talks about this experience. So a lot of these playwrights themselves have relatives in Russia. I'll read just a sampling. Tatiana Katsenko, Call Things by Their Names. War is when you're going west through Ostomel and a downed helicopter catches fire right above your head, and you rejoice because it belongs to the enemy. It is when you sleep in the bathtub at night, wake up from the bombs, and feel the walls vibrating. It is when you live in the subway for 4 weeks, know how to distinguish Grad rockets from bombing strikes, but don't know if your house survived. Also, when your relatives from Russia say it's all fake. Lyudmila Timoshenko, my Tara. My dad's brother, my uncle Valery, now lives in Bryansk in Russia. He and his family consider us fascists, and they support the Russian president in this war. Irina Haretz, planting an apple tree. I will come to you in a tank, says my uncle from Moscow. You are fascists and Nazis. You must be destroyed. Oh yes, Uncle Sasha. Women with babies in the maternity ward in Mariupol are your greatest enemy. And there are many more. This is just a few examples. Now, in advocating for the switch from Russian to Ukrainian, there are several reasons that Ukrainians provided, and I illustrate them here with a couple of memes. The one on the left is in Russian, and it says, "Speak Russian, we will come and defend you." The Russian world, which is represented by the cartoonish figures, right, of the three chief representatives of the Russian world, Putin in the middle, and then the defense minister of Russia, Shoigu, and Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church. The one in the middle is in Ukrainian, and it admonishes the enemy to say the word "palyanica," which is a loaf of bread in Ukrainian. This word is particularly hard for Russian speakers to pronounce correctly without giving out that they are Russian speakers. The soft "ta" at the end is very troublesome. And so Ukrainians have been using this word as a way to tell apart an enemy early on in the war. So it became a meme, and the implication is if you speak Ukrainian, you'll be safer on the battlefield. You'll be able to hide your communications from the enemy, and you will be able to also tell the enemy apart from the others. And finally, this third one just says, when I speak Ukrainian, bricks are falling off the Kremlin. And it illustrates this idea that using Ukrainian has become a weapon, a way of fighting against Russian propaganda that has declared that Ukraine does not exist, and Ukrainian culture does not exist, and Ukrainian language is not a real language. Okay, and just a few last slides, very briefly. Ukrainians' views on relations with Russia have changed as well. Some data from a sociologist, Oleksandra from Karazin National University in Kharkiv, this is the data for the summer of 2022, says that 91% of Ukrainians do not believe that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, as Russian propaganda says. 64% of Ukrainians do not believe that friendly relations with Russia will ever be possible again, will ever be restored. And 76% of Ukrainians support renaming of streets and other sites whose names are connected to the Russian Federation. And of course, this is a massive movement now across Ukraine to de-communize and to de-Russify Ukrainian spaces. What you see illustrated here at the top is the taking down of the monument in Kyiv to the Russian and the Ukrainian workers. And this was a big landmark celebrating supposedly the friendship between Ukrainian and Russian workers. And many other monuments are being taken down nowadays. So there are many other changes, such as changes in political views. Vastly more Ukrainians now support joining the EU. You can see the blue graph going up on the first image. So as of now, basically 87% of Ukrainians are in favor of joining the EU, and 86% in favor of joining NATO. These figures were very different prior to the full-scale invasion, and also even earlier, prior to the Revolution of Dignity and Kremlin's invasion of the Crimea. And Ukrainians' views on ending the war are also worth mentioning. Now, this has not changed very much from the beginning of the war. I remember the first week of the war, I looked up the data, and it was something like 87% of Ukrainians were confident that Ukraine would win, that they said that they want to continue fighting despite all of Russia's threats. And this figure has only grown a little bit, but remains quite steady. And now, however, 85% of Ukrainians are also saying that they will only accept the restoration of internationally recognized Ukrainian borders of 1991 as a victory. This is, a strong position. Not everyone in the international community agrees to this position, but Ukrainians feel like they have won the right through their struggle to dictate these rules. And finally, I will quote to you a redefinition of the word freedom from a word vocabulary by Ostap Slovensky. So this is a redefinition by Vadim, someone named Vadim from Konotop in central and eastern Ukraine. Freedom is such a thing, nobody's going to get it for you. Nobody will give you freedom. You won't get it as a present for yourself. You can't wait for it to arrive. You only get to make it for yourself. Yes, handmade. There are no freedom factories. It's not batch production. And perhaps this quote really encapsulates the main lesson Ukrainians have learned through this ordeal, that freedom is not free, and you have to fight for it. And so the fight continues. There are bad news, there's bad news every day, there's also uplifting news, but I think Ukrainians are confident that at the end there will be a victory. Thank you very much.